Section 2 for Chapter 1, the Neolithic Revolution and the Rise of Civilization. As we mentioned in the last section, we talked about the Paleolithic age, which was Greek for old stone. So the Neolithic age is Greek for new stone. This is the period of history from 8,000 to 4,000 BC, and in the New Stone Age, there was a shift to living as an agricultural society, and that was the biggest change from the Old Stone Age to the New Stone Age. So let's talk about systematic agriculture. It's really a fancy word for farming. It means to keep and raise animals and grow food on a systematic and regular basis. And because of that, they invented things like the plow. The plow did not have to be invented in the Old Stone Age because nobody was staying around long enough to have to plant and harvest and so forth. So they planted grains and vegetables on a regular supply, and depending on where the civilization began, depended on what they actually grew. Grains were typically part of a drier climate, and then other vegetables, yams and bananas were grown in more of a wet or warmer climate. So domestication, again, is simply taming animals for your own use. So you always had a steady source of milk, meat, and wool, and of course to use them on the farms to pull the plow and haul large amounts of grain. Because of agriculture, because of farming, the Neolithic, or the new ways of the Neolithic, was no longer to be nomadic as in the Old Stone Age. So they had to give those nomadic ways up. So on page 28, it shows you the different crops that were grown and about the time periods where those were found. So you can use that to help yourselves as well. But in words, it says in Southwest Asia, they grew wheat, barley, they raised pigs, cows, and sheep. In Southeast Europe, mostly wheat and barley. In Egypt and other parts of Africa, they grew wheat, barley. They had root crops, and that would be in warmer, wetter climates like yams, and then tree crops like bananas, again in the warmer, wetter climates. In Egypt in particularly, it was wheat and barley. In India, wheat and barley. Southeast Asia, rice. In China, rice, millet, and they had pigs and dogs. And then in Mesoamerica, which is Mexico and Central America, they had beans, squash, maize, which of course is corn, dogs, and fowl. Neolithic farming villages became a permanent location, so they no longer had the tents where they moved from place to place, and now they started building homes. So the farming villages were first found in Europe, India, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica. The oldest and biggest villages were found in Southwest Asia. Jericho is one of those locations, and Jericho is in modern-day Palestine near the Dead Sea. And that was one of the villages that we learned a lot about what life was like during the New Stone Age. The other one that is maybe a little bit more significant was Ch1. And Ch1 is found in present-day Turkey, but at this time period it was called Asia Minor. You can find a map for that on page 29. So it's in the south portion of modern-day Turkey. Ch1 was a village that was 32 acres large. There were about 6,000 people that lived there, and they created these simple mud flat-roofed houses that were kind of, really simple to construct and really simple to live in. They had sleeping platforms and kitchens, and that's it, or cooking areas. And they didn't need anything else. So when we look at a picture, you can see here that the entrance is at the top. So when you look right here, you can see the holes in the roof. That's how they got in there, and they had ladders to get up. And they were all connected because it was easier construction. If this home was built and I built this one, I would share a wall and only have 3 walls to build instead of 4. Some other pictures. Here you can see where they were walking on these roofs. animals, humans, they were all up there. And this is a modern day picture of some remains of these homes that were found in Ch1. Since you just saw that they were walking on the rooftops, they didn't really construct streets. And the farming that they focused on, they had 12 different products. They grew some fruits, nuts, and then they had wheat, but they had 3 varieties of wheat. They grew their own food, stored it so that they could survive on their own food. They had cattle, of course, which they would use for milk, meat, and hides. And even though they had agriculture, a lot of times they still had to hunt. So that had to supplement what their farming was already doing. Now, the fact that they had surpluses of food gave them more free time to dabble in some other things. And this caused them to create a division of labor. They discovered that not everybody needed to farm because they would farm much more large scale, and then they could store it, and then they would have food for a long time. Instead of being self-sufficient and growing your own food to feed your own family, they could have one person farm, and then that freed up other people with time. So they became artisans or skilled workers, and these artisans would specialize in making one thing. Maybe they were specializing in making those flat roofed homes. Maybe they would make the ladders that would go up there. Maybe they would make bowls or food or clothing or some other types of things. Once they were skilled workers and I made the ladders, I needed to trade or barter to get something else. Okay, I have ladders, but now I need shoes or I need a bowl. And so we would barter. And so bartering, of course, is just trading one good for another. Religion. We're not really 100% sure that they had religion, but we're pretty sure that they had some sort of religious ideas. They found many shrines, and that were figurines of some sort of gods or goddesses. And then there were also female figurines. So whether they believed all of their gods were goddesses, or they, put women as higher in the scale, if they were in the hierarchy, or what it meant, but women were mostly in these small figurines. All right, some other changes that made to their lifestyle is they really started to figure out how to make tools much more efficiently. The tools were more efficient, they were much more durable, like sickle and a hoe. And of course, those are both used for farming. So the sickle is, of course, the big, long, rounded knife that they would use to cut down the wheat. And of course, a hoe is exactly what it sounds like. It's using the tool to churn up the dirt. They had flaxseed and they had cotton primarily in India. And they used that to spin into some sort of yarn. And since they were spinning it, they were actually using a wheel. Now the wheel first invented was not like we use it primarily for vehicles or carts or transportation. It was mostly used for pottery wheels and spinning wheels. The relationship between men and women at this period of time is different than how it is now. Men were considered to be the primary farmers. They were there to herd the animals as well, and they were there to protect the families and the villages. Women were now into staying near the home. They would care for the children. They would do the spinning of the flax or the cotton to make yarn, and they would make things like cheese and so forth from the animals. This is the first time where the equality levels changed, so men and women were no longer equal, and because of these different skills and roles that they were to do, men became more dominant, and that's kind of how it stayed through history. All right, the end of the Neolithic age comes up when they're no longer going to use stone as their primary source for tools and weapons. As soon as something other than stone is going to be used, you can't call it a Stone Age. So the use of metals brought a different control over their environment. They could make things stronger, sharper, more durable. And so before 1000 BC, they figured out that if we heated some rocks that had some metal in it, they could turn that metal into a liquid, and then they would pour it into a mold to make whatever they were looking for, an axe, a spear, whatever they were trying to make. And they had really primitive ways of making that when they poured into a mold. Basically, it was forming a mold into sand and pouring that liquid into that sand. So it's not as fancy and modern as we make tools and weapons, but it's the same principle. So the first metal was used, that was copper, and that was used in Asia. And then in Asia, they also learned to discover that if we mix copper with another metal, tin, they could make bronze. And so this went pretty quickly from copper to bronze, and it's at that point where they decided that bronze was good enough and better and easier to work with than stone. So we're going to primarily make all of our tools and weapons out of bronze, and so now we'll call it the Bronze Age. And that was from 3000 to 1000 BC. After 1000 BC emerged the Iron Age, and of course this is where they figured out bronze was good, but iron is even more durable. And so that's when they started using primarily iron to make their tools and weapons. So at this point, the societies are becoming more complex. People are gaining wealth. Now, not money, because currencies have not been invented yet, but the wealth was determined on amount of farm animals, number of goods you had, those sorts of skills that you could make products. They started creating armies to protect themselves, and they built walls around their cities to also protect themselves. So it's at this point that they started to become what we would classify as a civilization. So you needed a culture, and that's a group's way of life. It's how they act, their religion, their language, how they dress, what they eat, what religion they have, everything. And so a civilization is a complex culture in which large numbers of people share those common ways of life. And so there are 6 characteristics of a civilization. First one is the need to have a city. And most of these first cities were developed near river valleys, and we'll discuss that more as we get into specific civilizations. The second thing they need is to have some sort of a government. The purpose of government then and now is to organize, make laws, regulate how we behave in our cities. And the first government were monarchs. In other words, it was ruled by a king or a queen. And it was the government's job to organize armies that would protect these cities. They also, of course, came up with laws, and the governments and religions tended to work together. So the role of the religion was really to explain why the sun came up, why it rained, why we had wheat, why we didn't, and that's how they explained everything. So they had many gods and goddesses, and they had some priests that would supervise some of the rituals to please those gods or goddesses. And again, a lot of times the king and queen and religion, they were connected. The rulers, again, were chosen supposedly by the gods, so they had divine approval. And then they had to create a new social structure. In doing that, you had different classes. The rulers in the upper class were considered the upper echelon, and that would be the priests, the government officials, and the warriors. Then you had the free people, which were the artisans, the farmers, the craftspeople with skills. And then the lower one would be the slave class. They also needed to have the use of writing. This was critical because in the prehistoric time period, there was no writing. So at first they used it just to keep inventory, just to keep records of maybe the amount of grain they had. But later on, they used it for other things, obviously. In the Inca civilization in Peru, did not write anything down. They memorized everything, and then they used a series of knots to keep track of certain things as well. So later on, writing started being used for more creative expression, but at first it was just for records. So then we lead to ourselves to art and artistic activity. Temples were built, pyramids were built for worship, sacrificing, burial for the kings, and they were very elaborate. They had painting, sculptured, that portrayed gods and goddesses, and nature. So to end, we've got a Far Side cartoon that says Thag Anderson became the first fatality as a result of falling asleep at the wheel. So he falls asleep at the wheel he's making, and you can see here a saber-toothed tiger going to come in and get him. One last invention that the book didn't really mention that happened during this time period was not only when the wheel was invented, but so was the sail.